The words Jesus Christ are some of the most readily recognised in the world. Over the centuries, literally thousands have died with these words on their lips, while millions continue to follow him nearly 2 millennia after his death. Yet others curse him or use his name without even knowing who he was, which raises a really interesting point. Did Jesus really exist? Or is his story simply a myth, some form of elaborate hoax perhaps?
Our search for Jesus begins where the legend began, in a small town near Jerusalem.
Today, Bethlehem is a town full of tourists and traffic.
But 2,000 years ago, it was a census decree by the Roman Emperor Augustus that brought the crowds to Bethlehem.
All of the inns were full in Bethlehem, and as the story goes, Mary and Joseph found accommodation in a private home very similar to this one.
The family lives upstairs, while the chickens, sheep and goats spend the nights in the basement. Clean and dry, it would have been quite acceptable by the standards of the time.
The Church of the Nativity. There's a real atmosphere in this place. This is the oldest Christian church in the world, and it's certainly one of the most popular. Thousands of pilgrims from around the world make their way to this location within the church, where tradition claims Jesus was born. The reigning king of the Jews was Herod the Great. He built this fortress on top of a hill just outside of Bethlehem. It's called the Herodian.
The same Herod sent his soldiers down to the town to murder all the boys under the age of 2.
Joseph and Mary fled to the safety of Egypt, where Jesus spent much of his early childhood. After the death of King Herod, they returned here to Nazareth. Today, the town is dominated by the Church of the Annunciation.
The Nazareth bazaars still sell food, household items, clothing and souvenirs. Perhaps little has changed since Joseph set up his carpenter's shop here 2,000 years ago.
Just off the main street of Nazareth is this old synagogue. It was built over the foundations of the older synagogue, possibly the one that stood here in the time of Jesus. Some have suggested that this was the place that Jesus worshipped in as a young man.
It's hard to know because, apart from the Bible, there is little evidence to substantiate the existence of Jesus in Nazareth.
There are a number of sources, Roman historians, philosophers, and of course the Jewish historian Josephus, who all make reference to the existence of Jesus. So in terms of the existence of Jesus Christ as a historical person, there's no question among ancient historians or archaeologists, none that I know of anyway, who question his existence. The real issue is, was he the Son of God or not? Or did he do the miracles or not? But the existence of Jesus, no question at all, as far as I'm aware.
6 kilometres from Nazareth lie the ruins of Sepphoris. It was the provincial capital of Galilee in the 1st century AD, and would have been under construction as the centre of Roman administration when Joseph and Jesus were carpenters. Perhaps they even helped build it. But Sepphoris is not even mentioned in the Bible. So what is its interest today?
It was a Roman city, basically, and what has intrigued scholars is the fact that it is so close to the town of Nazareth. In the past, people have thought that perhaps Jesus was, a rather uninformed individual. Perhaps he was living in a rural part of Roman Palestine, not exposed to the sophisticated culture that he would later experience in Jerusalem, or that existed elsewhere in the Roman Empire. But the presence of this very a beautiful city, actually. They found a large number of very beautiful buildings, wonderful mosaics. The craftsmen that worked there were top-notch craftsmen. This surprised the archaeologists, and it suggests that Jesus was probably exposed to a much more sophisticated culture than previously was thought.
While working in the carpenter shop, the Bible suggests that Jesus heard about John the Baptist. He travelled to the Jordan River and was recognised by John as the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. Jesus insisted that his cousin baptise him in the Jordan, and thus began his public ministry. Jesus is said to have spent much of this time in the northern part of Israel, around the Sea of Galilee.
The Sea of Galilee has always been the centre of the local fishing industry. Each morning, the fishermen sell their catch on shore. It was men like these who became Jesus' first disciples.
The Sea of Galilee is an inland lake, which is not very big, and it's small enough to produce a sloshing effect. That when the wind whistles down the valleys from one side or the other, pushes the waves into the far side, and then they bounce back and they hit the other waves coming in. It turns into a very, very nasty, choppy sea, very quickly and very easily.
On one occasion, Jesus is said to have stood up in the boat and said, "Peace, be still." The wind stopped and the waves abated. The disciples voiced the question that millions have asked since then: who can this be that even the wind and the sea obey him?
Nestled on the western edge of the lake is the city of Tiberias. Today it's a major tourist and holiday centre for the Israelis. But in the time of Jesus, it was a Roman city largely avoided by the Jews. Jesus began his work of teaching and preaching in the towns around Tiberias. Around here, possibly on this very mountain, he spoke to the crowd announcing the reason for his existence in words that they could clearly understand. It was his Sermon on the Mount. The people of Capernaum were glad to hear his teachings. Archaeologists have revealed this 4th century synagogue, possibly built on the site of the original synagogue used in the time of Jesus. If so, this is the place where Jesus would have preached.
But what kind of people lived around the shores of the Sea of Galilee?
The discovery of that first century village at Capernaum has enabled us to get a much more concrete feeling for the sort of physical environment in which Jesus worked. It was a very poor village. He was operating among very poor people. And when cold winds blow down from Mount Hermon, which is 10,000 foot high and which can have snow up to May, then it must have been a very miserable place.
As Jesus travelled from the Galilee region down to Jerusalem, he would have passed through the city of Jericho. They say that it may have been in this tree that he encountered the ruthless tax officer, Zacchaeus. The Jericho Road. Remember, Jesus told a story about a traveller on this road who was robbed, beaten, and left to die. Ignored by the religious leaders of the day, it was a hated Samaritan who stopped to care for him and who paid for his accommodation at a nearby inn.
The walk from Jericho up to Jerusalem is exhausting. In only 30 kilometres, it rises from 258 metres below to over 700 metres above sea level.
The Gospel writing suggests that Jesus spent some time in the city of Jerusalem, the region's major religious centre.
Jerusalem is a city with thousands of years of history. The streets of Jerusalem, although not following the same ground plan as 2,000 years ago, reflect a similar atmosphere to when Jesus walked them.
And these narrow streets seem to have a way of leading visitors to the Temple Mount.
This is the Dome of the Rock, the third most important religious site for the Muslim community.
Surrounding the mosque is a paved area which formed the courtyard of the original temple.
People come from all over the world to pray and leave messages at these ancient stones at the Western Wall. The wall is a centre of national celebration, a symbol of Israel's redemption and return to the Promised Land. Some Jewish people long for a Messiah, a political leader to help solve the present Palestinian-Israeli tensions and restore peace to their land.
The stones are over 1 metre wide and long. One is 13 metres long and weighs nearly 400 tonnes.
Historian Jerome Murphy O'Connor has written a popular guidebook on the city of Jerusalem.
Jerusalem in the days of Jesus was about the same size as the old city today. It was further to the south, but not quite as far to the north. The population of the old city today is probably about the same as the population of the city at the time of Herod the Great, the time of Jesus. That is roughly 60 to 70,000. And we worked this out on the amount of water that was available. We know that it couldn't have been higher than 70,000, but it may have been less.
Jerusalem is a city of conflict, but conflict is not new to this land. While sitting on the Mount of Olives, overlooking the temple, Jesus is said to have predicted that Jerusalem itself would be destroyed.
Not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down.
40 years later, in 70 AD, the Roman army surrounded the city in a 6-month siege. The Roman general Titus ordered that the beautiful temple be spared. But a soldier threw a firebrand inside and the building was soon destroyed. The soldiers prized apart the stones to get at the melted gold which had run down the cracks, then levered them over the edge of the temple platform into the valley below. In digging the foundations for modern buildings in Jerusalem, workmen uncovered the remains of a large house destroyed in 70 AD. The burnt house, as it's called, is now a museum.
The burned house was one of the buildings in the Jewish quarter that was excavated after 1967. And it was one of the buildings destroyed by the Romans when they stormed into the upper city after 2 years of siege in autumn of the year 70.
There is ample evidence of the city in which Jesus is said to have lived. But what about the details about his very public trial and crucifixion?
Recently, evidence of Caiaphas, the high priest at the time of Jesus, was found while workmen were building a new road. They discovered a tomb.
Inside were several stone boxes containing bones called ossuaries. One ossuary had the name Caiaphas inscribed in Hebrew. Scholars have identified the ossuary as belonging to the high priest Caiaphas, who presided over the trial of Jesus.
The recent installation of new underground pipes in Jerusalem led to the discovery of a street from the time of Jesus. Under some steps, archaeologists found a coin with the inscription of Pontius Pilate on it. This is further evidence that the Roman governor existed at the time of Jesus.
But this wasn't the first reference to Pilate.
The capital of Palestine for almost 600 years was the city of Caesarea. This city was founded by Herod the Great and was renowned for its magnificent buildings. The size of this aqueduct gives some idea of the population at the time. Because of its incredible beauty, some Roman governors chose to live here. A recently discovered inscription at this site mentions the name of Pontius Pilate, the governor at the time of Jesus.
The Gospel writers claim that during the trial of Jesus, Pilate was staying in Jerusalem at the headquarters of the Roman garrison, a palace fortress built by Herod the Great.
Because the Jews didn't have the power of the death penalty, Jesus was dragged to this building to be tried again before the Roman authorities.
The Bible account suggests that Pilate knew Jesus was innocent, but was caught in a web of intrigue and blackmail. And bringing him before the crowds in the open plaza, he declared, "Behold the man." The crowd's cry of "Crucify him" was what condemned Jesus to death. And washing his hands of the affair, Pilate ordered Jesus to carry the cross designed for Barabbas, a local criminal. And so he began his journey through the streets of Jerusalem.
The traditional way of the cross, the Via Dolorosa, winds its way through the lanes and bazaars of Old Jerusalem to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre.
For 1700 years, the traditional church has identified this as the site of Jesus' crucifixion. Within the church is a rocky outcrop said to be the Hill of the Skull, or Golgotha in the Hebrew language.
Under the great rotunda of the church, there is an ancient rock-cut tomb that's supposed to be the tomb of Jesus. Tradition may well have preserved the exact site.
The temple was later demolished, and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was built on the site in the 4th century. Excavations in the area have uncovered tombs that were typical of the time.
If the New Testament record is accurate, in just 24 hours, Jesus fulfills scores of predictions, some made more than 1,000 years earlier by the Old Testament prophets. It's an interesting proposition, because the prophets could not possibly have predicted the Messiah's precise death without some sort of supernatural leading. On the other hand, Jewish writers would not have inserted the prophecies into the Old Testament after the event, since they didn't believe that Jesus was the Messiah anyway. And it seems rather bizarre that a mere man would set out to claim to be the Messiah and arrange to have himself killed in order to substantiate that claim, particularly when many of the predicted events would have been outside of his control. Let's look closely at some of them. 500 years before Christ, the prophet Zechariah told of the future betrayal, even nominating the sum to be paid as a bribe.
Then I said to them, "If it is agreeable to you, give me my wages, and if not, refrain." So they weighed out for my wages 30 pieces of silver.
What was to happen to this money? According to the same prophet, it was to be paid to a potter.
And the Lord said to me, "Throw it to the potter, that princely price they set on me." So I took the 30 pieces of silver and threw them into the house of the Lord for the potter.
It's uncanny. But according to the Gospels, Judas was paid 30 pieces of silver for leading the mob to arrest Jesus in the garden. When Judas realized that Jesus wasn't going to free himself and declare himself king, he panicked. Going back to the temple, he threw the silver coins on the floor in front of the priests and ran out and hanged himself. The Gospel of Matthew suggests that the priests suddenly became very scrupulous about returning blood money to the treasury, and instead bought a potter's field, according to Matthew 27:7, for burying foreigners who died in Jerusalem. 1,000 years before Christ, and long before crucifixion became a popular Roman method of execution, King David wrote in the Psalms,
"They pierced my hands and my feet."
The Gospel writers say that Jesus' hands and feet were pierced by long and rusty Roman nails as he was impaled on the cross.
The method of crucifixion in antiquity, something which was done for hundreds of years. Up until now, there's only one case that's ever been discovered, which is rather interesting, because it came from Jerusalem. It's from around 2,000 years ago, and it was discovered here in 1968. What we found, here's the heel bone of an individual, of a young man who was crucified. What we're looking at here is the right heel bone, and we see the nail going laterally through the heel. Prior to that, they drove it into a piece of wood. It then went through the heel into the tree, probably struck a knot in the tree, fish hooked, and it was impossible to remove it from the victim's leg. What we see here, perhaps this is a bit easier in terms of understanding what happened there. We have the right foot, we have a nail, which was about 10.5 centimeters long. They drove it first through a piece of olive wood. We can still see after 2,000 years it was olive wood. This acts as a washer. Now the thing perforated the heel from the outside. They then drove it into the tree like this here. The individual was straddling the tree, left foot, right foot. When this went in, it probably struck a knot. They could take him down, but they couldn't get the nail out. Now the reason that I think this is the only case in the world that's ever been discovered is that most people were probably tied to crosses during crucifixion rather than nailed. For example, if you look at Christian icons, what do we see? We see that the good thief and the bad thief are always tied. Jesus is the only one who gets crucified. What most people don't realize is you can crucify a person and have him dead within minutes, or you can crucify a person and have him dead within days. Depends upon how sadistic are the executioners, how many people are waiting in line, so on and so forth. But if I were to take a young man, tie his hands together, support him from a beam, he's dead within an hour through asphyxiation. If you were to hold his feet so he can't pull himself up and down, because the problem here is one of getting rid of the air. You can inhale, but you can't exhale. If you were to hold this victim's feet, or nail his feet, so he can't pull himself up and down, he's dead within 6 to 10 minutes. On the other hand, if you want him to be up there for long periods of time, what you do is you would extend the arms out in this manner here. Perhaps put a seat underneath the buttocks. There's many, many ways to do it. But we know that you can keep them up there for hours, or you can keep them up there even for days. In this position, you don't die because of asphyxiation. The body goes into what's called hypovolemic shock. It's a very common form of shock, and that's the cause of death.
Over the years, many have claimed to know the exact whereabouts of Calvary and the place of Jesus' tomb.
Some Christians point to an alternative site to the traditional place of crucifixion. This hill of the skull is just north of the Damascus Gate. Here on a stony bluff, the wind and rain has eroded 2 eyes and a nose, somewhat resembling the shape of a skull.
First identified by General Gordon of Khartoum fame, the site is known as Gordon's Calvary, which is Latin for the skull. A good example of a 1st century AD tomb is the family vault of Herod the Great on the western side of Jerusalem. At the entrance is a round stone which was rolled across the door to seal the tomb. This is similar to the one in which Jesus was said to have been buried.
It probably doesn't matter where Jesus' tomb was. But of far greater interest is the New Testament claim that he rose from it.
People have tried to come up with different explanations to show that Jesus didn't die or that he wasn't raised from the dead. A very commonly occurring one, and one that's been revived recently by an Australian academic, is the fact that he may have just fainted on the cross, and that the 1st century Roman soldiers and the people looking on didn't realise the difference between coma and death. Now, I don't think that holds water, because if you read the Gospel accounts, the Roman centurion made sure Jesus actually had died. Jesus died faster than they expected. So, to ensure that he was actually dead and not just unconscious, the Roman centurion took a spear and gave him a deadly wound, pierced him through his heart. So, it is clear that Jesus died.
We don't really know what happened, but from a textual point of view, the New Testament record has a ring of truth about it. The disjointed accounts are consistent with typical eyewitness accounts. A forgery, written decades later, would have told a much more coherent narrative, and considering the cultural status of women at the time, would probably have avoided using them as witnesses, much less having them first on the scene. Resurrection from death is a feature of Old Testament messianic prophecy.
For you will not leave my soul in Sheol, the grave, nor will you allow your Holy One to see corruption.
The New Testament book of Acts records thousands of people listening to the disciple Peter, eagerly pointing out the fulfillment of this prophecy and claiming that Jesus had risen to life again in Acts 2:30 and 31. Additionally, many historians and writers in the century after Christ wrote of him. Flavius Josephus was the commander of the Jewish forces in Galilee at the time of the Jewish revolt in 66 AD. He defected to the Romans, but wrote a famous history of his people and the war that followed.
Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as receive the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ, and when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct at this day.
There are also other writers who mention Jesus. Lucian, a satirist of the 2nd century. Suetonius, another Roman historian under the Emperor Hadrian, about 120 AD. Pliny the Younger, who was the governor of Asia Minor about 112 AD. Justin Martyr, who wrote to the Emperor Antonius Pius and referred to Pilate's report, which was in the imperial archives. And Tertullian, who wrote about 197 AD. If Jesus of Nazareth did exist as a person, and the evidence seems rather compelling that he did, then what do we do with his claims about who he was?
Other good people were martyred. For example, John the Baptist in his own time. But the fact that he was resurrected is the only way we can explain why his movement arose and survived, and why those who were his followers and had been his disciples now worshipped him.
Whether Jesus rose from the dead is one of the central issues of Christianity. If he did, it changes history. If someone comes back from the dead, then we have hope for ourselves beyond death. And Christianity is about a future, about a resurrection future where we will have a new life.
The people like Alexander the Great, for example, made a tremendous impact on history because of their positions, because of their power, and consequently because of their conquests. Jesus' influence could not rest on any such thing. He had no real estate. He held no office on earth. And no extrinsic power. He had no wealth. The only thing that he had was the influence of his own extraordinary personality and teachings, and ultimately his rather spectacular death.
And if he was who he claimed to be, then he was more than just a good man or a great moral teacher. Jesus was God, who came to the earth, the true liberator of humanity. What you and I decide to do about this claim and its significance to our lives may be the most important decision we will ever make.